Does form dictate function, or does function dictate form? From the time of Aristotle, people have noted that certain functions can only be performed if certain features are present. Clearly, form dictates function. You can't drink out of a glass with a hole in the bottom. This follows for the smallest unit of life, the cell. Cells must be in touch with their outer environment to maintain homeostasis and to exchange nutrients, enzymes, and waste with their external environment. This leads to the necessity of cells using the process of diffusion or active transport to get the proper materials across the membranes. However, active transportation of materials across cell membranes requires energy. Therefore, a cell expends energy in active transport. So, diffusion is the most energy efficient way for materials and water to flow across membranes and within the cell. This is illustrated by this ball slowly traveling across the table. For the ball to move rapidly, more energy input is needed. Of course, the material itself and its size will determine whether a molecule can be passively transported or if it will need to be actively transported. But diffusion is a slow process, and once the material diffuses into the cell, it must reach all parts. This is dependent on how much surface area the cell has, which exposes it to its external environment. Also, internally, if the cell is large, the fluid will take a longer time to reach the center. This is demonstrated by the fact that the surface area of a circle increases with the square of its radius, but its volume increases by the cube of its radius. In other words, as the volume of the cell goes up, the relative surface area that the cell exposes to the external environment is relatively less, and therefore the surface area to volume ratio goes down. This is demonstrated by the following models. The first model, we have a 4-inch sphere, and it is compared to a 5-inch sphere. We see that the surface area of the 4-inch sphere is 50.27 inches squared, and the volume is 33 inches squared, cubed. This leads to a surface area to volume ratio of 1.5. In contrast, the 5-inch sphere has a much larger surface area of 78 inches squared, but its volume is doubled that of the 4-inch circle. Its surface to volume ratio is 1.2. If these spheres were in a fluid that turned the sphere white and it traveled at the same rate, we can see from the models that the big sphere would have a lot less contact with the fluid, as demonstrated by the larger blue area in the center. Therefore, cells can only grow so large, yet adaptations in cell size have increased the surface areas to volume ratios. This is demonstrated by 3 separate blocks. The first is a block with dimensions of 2, 4, and 8. Its volume is 66 inches cubed, which is almost the same as the 5-inch sphere. By changing the shape, we increase the surface area to volume ratio to 1.74. On the next block with the same volume of 66 inches cubed, we change the dimensions to a thinner block, and by doing so the surface area to volume ratio jumped to 2.52, meaning that more fluid could diffuse into the cell. Lastly, by creating an irregular surface, the volume of 66 inches cubed was the same, but the surface area to volume ratio increased to 2.9. How do cell shapes work? An example would be a red blood cell. The cell is small, and in its mature state it has no nucleus or mitochondria, and gets its energy from glycolysis in the cytoplasm. Because the cell is small, oxygen can diffuse easily to the hemoglobin molecules and can be given up to the tissues. Similarly, a liver cell is a square cell that is packed in the liver, and it relies on a large surface area to volume ratio so that it can take up toxins to break them down and to make fats on its smoothie R, particularly cholesterol. Another type of cell that has adapted a new shape is a muscle cell. Muscle cells are very metabolically active and have lots of mitochondria. They need to be long so that they can accommodate cross-linking actin and myosin fibers, which cause muscle contraction. The exercise band is representational of muscle cells expanding and contracting. This takes a lot of energy, and the long, thin muscle cell can contract and expand to about 10 to 100 microns. All this activity requires a lot of fluids and glucose crossing the membrane, so a thick, fat cell would not support muscle activity. Finally, the irregular shape of an intestinal lining cell with microvilli allows the uptake of fluid and nutrients. The large villi increase the surface area for absorption. In conclusion, cells have adapted different shapes as we have evolved into multicellular organisms. And this then brings us back to the point of, does function dictate form through natural selection? But this is a question for another day.